I recall reading a small Washington Post report on retired General Zinni's opposition to the invasion of Iraq. And the last two paragraphs said, many in the US Army and the Pentagon agree with him. So the first point I think that needs to be made is the epidemic of self-censorship that keeps otherwise sensitive, good people from speaking out in our country at the right time and in the right place. The Roman historian Tacitus once said, "The worst crimes were dared by few, willed by more, and tolerated by all." The great historian Edward Gibbons, in analyzing the fall of democracy in ancient Athens, had this to say, quote, "In the end, more than they wanted freedom, they wanted security. They wanted a comfortable life, and they lost it all. Security, comfort, and freedom. When freedom they wished for was freedom from responsibility, then Athens ceased to be free," end quote. I'm glad to attribute this quote to Bruce Fein in his excellent book called Constitutional Peril, followed by his book American Empire Before the Fall. We've all been exposed in the last 3 days to very lengthy remembrances of 9/11 and the people who lost their lives there, with some attention to the first responders who are still losing their lives from that exposure of the collapse of the buildings, but with very little attention, very little empathy for the millions of people from Iraq to Afghanistan and Pakistan who have been losing their lives, who have been injured, or who have been sick. There isn't even enough attention to the number of US soldiers who've been injured in Iraq and Afghanistan, because the definition is that they have to be injured in the middle of combat, which leaves out 2/3 of the injuries, not to mention the illnesses from sandfly disease. And of course, the Pentagon doesn't cover or count civilian deaths. That's the primitive level of statistical responsibility that we've been exposed to over the years. No counting of civilian deaths other than to lowball them immensely, and low counting of US injuries and illnesses. There was a wonderful statement by the September 11th families that needs to be given some attention. This is a group of families who lost their relatives at 9/11, and they put out a marvelous statement, which I'll read later, that indicates the expansive morality, sensitivity, empathy, and strategic superiority of their position. And of course, they're not experts. They're not national security people. Just very briefly, this statement by the September 11th families for peaceful tomorrows. Here's what they said just a couple days ago. Quote, "The members of September 11th families for peaceful tomorrows are grateful for the expressions of remembrance and concern being offered on the 10th anniversary of the events which took the lives of our loved ones. On this day, we ask those who feel compassion for our loss to expand their compassion to include others who continue to experience loss 10 years later. Innocent families in Afghanistan and Iraq experiencing the loss of their loved ones and displacement from their communities as a result of war and political strife. Muslim Americans subjected to bias and violence at home. Those denied the protections of our Constitution and law, whether in Guantanamo, or in our own country. Those suffering from job loss and economic dislocation related to the cost of the war and rising military budgets, and those who have seen their civil liberties and freedoms exchanged for the false promise of security. The lesson of 9/11 is that we live in a connected world. We rise or fall together. As Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. said, quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere," end quote. On this 10th anniversary, let us honor those we lost by recognizing our kinship with people all over the world and affirming the values and principles that will guarantee peaceful tomorrows for everyone, end quote. What a declaration of conscience. Can we have some questions, please?